Welcome to this Veritas Forum. We are happy to have two eminent speakers with us today. We have Jordan Cooper with us from the States. So he's a professor at the Lutheran Theological Seminary and also a Lutheran minister himself. And we have philosophy docent Jani Hakkarainen here at Tampere University. But the theme today is how do reason, goodness and beauty go with God and the meaning of life. So we have this common ground, reason, goodness and beauty. And then we will have different perspectives on what to do with them. They will give short introductions or 15 minutes each and then comment on each other. And then we will see what that discussion leads to and at some point open up for questions from the audience. Now we are ready to hear the first presentation from Jordan Cooper.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's a blessing to be able to be here with all of you this evening. I flew here from Washington, D.C. With no sleep overnight, so I apologize if I'm somewhat incoherent. I will do the best I can with a serious lack of sleep. As you heard the introduction here, you heard this language about crisis. And I think that it is really inescapable that the Western world is in a time of crisis. And I think that is true across the Western world. Of course, I'm coming from an American context, but it's certainly not a uniquely American problem. Depression rates among young people are skyrocketing. And I think in the midst of what has been described as a meaning crisis, which I think is a proper name for it, a lot of people have begun to rethink a lot of questions of the most basic human questions, things like, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning in life? Is there a broader meaning in life? And so I want to speak to you about that this evening in the brief time that we have together. Now, this is framed here, this talk, as speaking of what we call the three transcendentals. Truth, goodness, and beauty. The three transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty has often been used as a kind of shorthand to refer to various elements of reality that have been recognized by the classical Western philosophical tradition, extending back to the ancient Greeks and then through the lens of the Christian tradition in the West. Now, these transcendentals, and we use that language of transcendentals, we're speaking about elements of reality that are fundamental. We're speaking about those elements of reality or of our existence that exist beyond and prior to this material realm, but things that also encapsulate the material realm around us within them. We encounter these three realities, truth, goodness, and beauty, in our daily experiences in the world. And these are really lenses by which we judge all sorts of things and interactions and things we see and things we hear throughout an ordinary day, even if you're not thinking in these precise terms. We determine that some things are true when we hear them, or we determine that other things are false. We determine that some things are good and that some things are evil. We see some things as beautiful and other things as ugly. Now, we make these kinds of quick judgments oftentimes in an unconscious kind of way. Now, of course, there are times when we might be logically thinking through something to make a rational argument for, is this a morally good action to take in this or that scenario. But I think most of our judgments about each of these three realities is often more instinctive than that. It is broader than that. Now, speaking of this threefold distinction of truth, goodness, and beauty, this exact distinction in this kind of Trinitarian threefold form does not actually originate with Plato or Aristotle. They actually speak of a number of transcendentals. Truth, goodness, and beauty kind of show up there, but there are a number of different lists. There's no precision. It's actually a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what the origin of putting the list in this threefold formula is. We see in older formulations, unity or oneness is also described as transcendental. Nonetheless, I'm sticking with this typical threefold characterization. That doesn't mean that we can't extend beyond this, but I think it is a quite helpful one, and there is a reason why I think this threefold formulation has stuck. Now, I think the part of the reason why this threefold understanding of the transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty has stuck is because this kind of roughly corresponds to three elements of the inner life of every person. We are a composite of a number of different things, but we have a mind or an intellect. We have wills, and we also have affections. Now, I think there is a kind of rough correspondence that we can make between these three transcendentals and those realities that are just part of our daily inner life. With the rational element of our human natures, we make judgments. We make judgments about truth and about falsehood. With the will, we take action. And there is, of course, an interrelation between the will and the mind. As we're talking about the transcendentals, they all interrelate with one another. They mutually influence one another. But with the will, we enact decisions. Now, those decisions may be foolish decisions, ones where we haven't properly used our reason prior to making those decisions. But the decisions that we make, I think most people would desire that the decisions that they make would be good ones rather than bad ones or evil ones. And so the will aligns with this notion of the good. But then we have this affective element of our nature. We are desiring creatures. We love things. We hate things. We feel different emotions and desires and delights. And it is beauty that is the transcendental that speaks to this other element of our daily existence, of our nature. I think sometimes we perceive ourselves as more rational beings than we actually are. I think we would like to think of ourselves as beings who make logical judgments about the world, who are able to kind of step outside of our experiences and just make a rational evaluation of all of the different options, and then calculate what the most logical option is. I don't think that's really how human beings tend to function. I posit that a large portion of our decisions throughout the day are really made in view of our desires, really questions of beauty. And again, this isn't always something that we're consciously thinking about. To make a decision based on beauty doesn't mean that you have to be, evaluating some, say, classical piece of art and thinking through the particulars of the symmetry in that art or the methodology and techniques that were used in the painting. When you make very basic decisions, like, what clothes am I going to put on this morning so I look decent? That's a judgment about beauty. And we make those kinds of judgments all throughout the day. Now, the capacities that exist within us as human beings all have some kind of end toward which they point. And we could think about, for example, the appetites that we have, like the needs that we have for physical things, right? So you feel certain ways when there is a need that needs to be fulfilled. Your body is kind of telling you, for example, when you feel hunger, that you need to eat, right? So you have a feeling of emptiness, a feeling that there is something that is lacking because this is kind of a recognition to you, it's a signal to you that you need to go find the thing that is going to then fill that need. And then you're going to feel satisfied, right? So if you feel very tired, like I do right now, after getting some sleep, then You might not feel tired anymore, right? Because that need has now been fulfilled. You don't have that kind of sense of longing for that thing anymore. When you eat a good and large meal, you're hungry. At the end of the meal, you are hungry no longer. But we are more than just physical beings. We have more than just these physical desires to please our physical appetites with things like drinks and food and sleep. There are far deeper, more lingering longings in our capacities, in ourselves, which are not fulfilled through mere physical things. Human beings are not happy only if they have their physical needs met. Think, for example, about decorating a home. If we're beings that are merely physical things and there's nothing really beyond that, why aren't we just happy to have a space that serves its basic function, has some sense of utility? Why is it that we hang up images on our walls? Why do you put a painting on the wall of your home? Why do you care what color or pattern your couch is? It doesn't really have a use. It doesn't really serve any kind of clear biological need, but yet those in some ways are the most human of needs. Why is it that human beings have chosen to express themselves through poetry? You could probably get across the basic facts and information that is contained in a poem in another way, more clearly, right? If you just kind of write it out as some kind of clear, logical statement. Because we understand that there is something within us, deep within us, that longs for something beyond. Now, I think that these inner desires that we have, these inner desires we have for truth, these inner desires we have for goodness, these inner desires that we have for beauty, in some sense, they're never really fully satisfied in this life. The one who seeks for truth always continues to look for truth, to contemplate, to reason things out. It's not like the search for truth just ends when we find some particular piece of information that we really want. And then we say, okay, well, I figured that out. I'm good. I don't need to think anymore. There is a desire that still longs to be fulfilled. And I think this is true with the good. This is true with the moral life, right? In the moral life, if we are trying to live a good life, there is a constant striving toward that. There is a kind of running the race, a constant effort that is needed. There is a goal that we never seem to reach. And I think the same thing is true also about beauty. You know, we get these kind of little glimpses of beautiful things in our experience, those kinds of moments that you have where something just kind of overtakes you and you are so drawn into, whether it's a beautiful piece of music or a beautiful sunset or a piece of art, that you kind of forget everything else and just take in the delight of that experience. Those kinds of experiences are fleeting. Those kinds of experiences happen in these kind of little bursts that leave us wanting or desiring for something more, because they don't seem to fully satisfy this inner hunger that we have. As I think about this inner hunger that we have, this inner sense of wanting some purpose beyond ourselves, I think there are two elements to this sense of loss, or this sense of not having the fullness of what we are searching for. There is a looking back and a looking forward. The concept of nostalgia is something that is quite fascinating in human beings. A lot of people are nostalgic for something that happened in their childhood. People tend to be nostalgic for the age in which they grew up. And as we look back with the sense that things were so much better back then. If only we could go back, if only we could recapture what I had, that was happiness then. Why do we do that? Is it really because you were that happy back then? You know, I have nostalgia for my own childhood. It's true, when I look back at the 1990s, when I was a kid, I'm like, this was like the perfect age. Was it really? No. Was I always happy as a child? Of course not. And if you ask somebody at that time if this was really the perfect age, if everything was great, then of course they would say no. What nostalgia does is it gives us a picture of something that's not actually real. Right? It takes some reality that is there, but then perfects it in a way that we've never actually known, but we know that we need. There is this sense of homelessness that we have. But then there is also a looking forward that we often have in our lives, where we look forward to thinking that, well, once I get through this stage of my life, once this thing happens, then I will have achieved my end. Then I will be happy, right? When I get married, I'll find happiness there. When I get a better house, I'll find happiness there. We're always looking forward to the next thing, because we're always left with this sense of longing of, we're not quite there, but I want to achieve it and will receive whatever that thing is that's going to fulfill my inner longings. And so what I submit to you today with all of this is that if we have these inner longings that are really not fulfilled in the things of this life, that there is always a sense of there is more, then maybe there is more. Maybe the problem is that we are looking for the fulfillment of these inner longings in things that are not actually meant to fulfill those needs that we have as human beings. And I submit to you that these longings are pointing forward to a reality that is eternal, toward God, your Creator, to an eternal soul, to the things that won't so easily pass away. And maybe the reason we look back so much with so much fondness is because we have a sense that there is a home that I don't have right now, and that's where I belong. And that sense, I submit to you, is fulfilled in God's promises that He gives to us. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all here. And also, I would like to thank Veritas Forum for having me here tonight. So, I kind of agree with Professor Cooper that there is a meaning crisis, at least in the so-called Western world, and perhaps even wider. But I would like to suggest that we should look into especially late 18th century German philosophy, namely Bildung philosophy, to have some perhaps fruitful perspective on this crisis now in the 21st century. And I'm going to say you a few words about that. And this is, of course, more like a... And these opening words will be kind of highlights of a particular Bildung philosopher, especially at the end of 18th century, namely Friedrich Schiller, who you can see there on the screen as well. And especially his masterpiece, philosophical masterpiece. Of course, he was and still is perhaps more well known as a playwright, and also wrote many important poems. But his perhaps main philosophical work is the work from 1795 entitled, in English translation, On the Aesthetic Education of Man, in a series of letters. Unfortunately, we have also a very good Finnish translation of this work, Kirjeitä ihmisen esteettisestä kasvatuksesta. And the original German title you can see on the screen. But I will also use, and mainly use actually, secondary sources, kind of latest best scholarship on Schiller and his Bildung philosophy, especially by Frederick Z. Beiser and Jennifer A. Hurd. Okay. There are, of course, several misconceptions about Bildung. And that's why I want to say a few words about, first, what it is not. So, for example, it is not knowing old masters in art, such as Goethe or Beethoven, by heart. It is not good general knowledge only. This is also very common Finnish use of the Finnish word, that it means something like having very good general knowledge or yleistieto in Finnish. But it's not only that at all. And it's not solely having good manners, so-called polite conduct or behavior only. Perhaps it is that, but that's not the core thing. And of course, Bildung was, especially after the Second World War, also philosophically highly criticized, that it created this kind of ideal of inward-looking, escaping from the world, and even a kind of navel-gazing, but it's not that either. So what is Bildung then, according to Schiller in particular? Of course, the first observation is that there were different views on Bildung defended in the classic German Bildung philosophy among the Enlightenment philosophers such as Kant or Wolff, Christian Wolff, then Weimar classicists like Schiller and Goethe, and also early romantics or romantic philosophers like Novalis or the Schlegels. But what is common in them, I think, is that humanity is not complete, either collectively or individually. So the core idea in these Bildung philosophies is that Bildung is the process of cultivation of humanity. So sometimes, of course, they use the German verb bilden, which kind of is perhaps better than this noun Bildung to come across with the processual nature of Bildung. So in Finnish, I would say rather actually sivistyminen than sivistys, which kind of makes it clearer that it's about a process. Process toward what? Towards yet unachieved human perfectibility. That is complete or full humanity. And it's not only process towards complete or full humanity, but in a very important sense, this process is also supposed to be open-ended. So its end result is not given. And what is very important here also, especially in the cases like Schiller and Wilhelm von Humboldt, that there is, and of course the early romantics, that there is individual variety in what kind of individually complete or full humanity consists in. And theoretically, among these philosophers, views on the complete humanity varied as well. But there was a relatively wide consensus, though, at least for the present purposes, that Bildung is at least the balance of powers and capabilities constituting a harmonious integrated whole. So, for example, it was considered the balance of our powers to get in the truth, for example, and also to be good, morally and otherwise, and beautiful, especially the moral beauty. But also outward beauty, like looking good. So individually, Bildung is then processing towards the balance and integrated harmony true to oneself. And of course, some of us are better at one thing, for example, academically, and others are at another thing, like in arts or sports or politics or whatever. So this was something that especially Wilhelm von Humboldt kind of emphasized, this individual variety, but also then, of course, early romantic thinkers, of course. But kind of more generally and perhaps theoretically, Schiller pointed out that this harmony is harmony of our reason and sensibility. So our capacity to reason, to get in the truth, for example, but also practical reason in quite Kantian fashion, and our sensibility, namely our power to sense with our senses, to feel, and to desire something. And Schiller has had this idea that, and why he's talking about aesthetic education in this masterpiece, is that art can promote this harmony between reason and sensibility by, for example, elevating examples. And you can think as an kind of example his own well-known poem Ode to Joy, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which of course makes uses that poem by Schiller. And therefore they came up with this idea, which was also very important for the early Romantics, that art can function as a kind of new religion, so in German, Kunstreligion. So anyway, Bildung is thus self-realization and self-perfection, both individually, which varies depending on the individual, and collectively as the human kind. And this is also freedom. Freedom in what philosophers call the positive sense, roughly speaking, self-determination. And also connected to this, moral autonomy and internalized ethics as an inclination. So especially Schiller emphasized this point very much, according to Beiser, because the political context of the aesthetic education work was actually the terror in French Revolution in the early 1790s. So Schiller came up with this idea that, for example, Kantian ethics as such is not sufficient to have a well-functioning republic or even kind of a constitutional monarchy, but the correct ethics, the right ethics needs to be internalized, so we should be inclined to behave morally in a morally correct way. And this we can, at least in principle, achieve with the process of Bildung. So therefore, Beiser speaks about, in the case of Schiller, of Bildung as ethics of freedom, perfection, and self-realization, and it can be distinguished, even though it comes quite close to Kant's ethics, still it needs to be distinguished from Kant's more like ethics of duty. And the early Romantics stressed the cultivation of the power of love and the ethics of love too. Oh, sorry. Okay. But what I find very intriguing, especially if you think about this in the historical context of the late 18th century, that, or at least how I understand this, is that this vision of Bildung is a secular vision. So the point is that all this Bildung is supposed to happen, perfection is supposed to happen in this life, not in some afterlife or supernatural life or whatever religious views on that you might have. So it's immanent to this life, and it's also finite, because this life is, I think, finite, not infinite. And this life is also social life. We human beings are social animals. So actually, Bildung cannot happen, according to Schiller and Wilhelm von Humboldt, for example, in kind of a hermit life. It can only happen in interaction with other people, so in social life. So if you think about Bildung, self-perfection, complete humanity individually and collectively as the humankind, as the meaning of life, giving meaning to life and giving it purpose. According to this philosophy, or at least how I understand it, is that the meaning of life is immanent and finitist, and of course this separates or contrasts it with different kinds of religious views, where are more like a transcendent and infinitist in this sense. So Beiser puts Schiller's view quite nicely in this respect. I think I quote Beiser: "The development of the whole personality, the cultivation of sensibility and individuality, as well as rationality." And actually the early Romantics went so far that they visioned that we should make ourselves and our lives works of art. But that means that, roughly speaking, that in being a work of art here means that then we are these kind of integrated, harmonious persons, where different powers and capabilities are in kind of a correct kind of harmony. And connecting to the title of this event, one can see that actually this is a kind of novel variant of the classic and also rationalist triad of reason or truth, good and beauty. So in the philosophical context, in the early 18th century, late 17th century, Leibniz, of course, in German, was one of the philosophers who endorsed this classic and rationalist triad in of course, a peculiar way between these three, as Professor Cooper put it, kind of a classical way, these three transcendentals. But the point here is, as I see that in the classical Bildung philosophy of Schiller in particular, what is perhaps novel here, at least in the historical context, kind of immediate historical context, is that this view or vision is rather secular and immanent and finitist than transcendent and infinitist in these existential terms. But perhaps I stop there so we can open up the discussion. Thank you.
Do you have a comment?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the presentation. As I think about, what you've presented, I feel like the majority of it is, I would agree with. I like the majority of what you're saying are exactly the things that I would discuss in terms of what it means to live a good life, a fulfilling life. When you talk about that kind of harmony, right, the harmony between the different elements of the human person, that sounds to me also very Aristotelian. I think that kind of language of harmony is deeply within the classical tradition as well. So I have, I have a couple things that I would just kind of ask you to just, give your thoughts on in relation to this. So two things. The first thing that stands out to me is this focus on kind of this inner authenticity, this notion that freedom and being authentic to self seems to be an essential element of what it means to kind of live the good life in this vision. And I guess the question there is, as I live in a country that prizes freedom above all else, right? Freedom of everything, freedom of choices of 100 different brands of peanut butter in the grocery store. That there's this kind of perception that the optimization of choices, right? The optimization of freedom is going to lead to a greater levels of happiness. And just in terms of like psychological studies that have been done on these issues, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Like it seems as if there is, along with this feeling that one needs to find an authentic self in order to live according to that, creates this kind of increased anxiety about having to find some inner self, or what if I do the wrong thing? And sociologists have discussed this recently, what they've called FOBO, a fear of better options, which is this idea that like people are crippled in making choices because they're like, what if I make the wrong one? Then they don't make any choice. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. And then, the second part of this, and maybe this is the more essential element, is I agree with a lot of what's being said and what you're pointing out. I think these are all very beneficial things. But the question is just what's grounding that? Like metaphysically, what's grounding that? Is this arbitrary? What determines what the harmonies of like the soul and the reason? Who determines what that is? And what I have a hard time seeing in this perspective that this is all finite is the question of like, but is there really meaning behind this, or is this a mere kind of construction of our minds that we're just kind of convincing ourselves that we feel like there's meaning to this, but there really isn't anything metaphysically kind of underneath that's grounding that?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Great questions. So first about the freedom. So you were talking about freedom of choice in grocery store, for example, and of course we have the same thing here in Finland. There are so many breads nowadays that it's sometimes hard to decide which bread to take. But this is rather what we philosophers called negative freedom. So freedom from constraint. So the choices are not so much constrained. So there is a lot of variety among which you can choose. But here the freedom is rather freedom in the positive sense. So meaning roughly that you are free when you are self-determined. But of course this now becomes to sound very individualistic, but this is, I think, a misconception as well. But of course I had only 15 minutes. But this is at least very close to Kant's view of moral autonomy. So perhaps, I'm not sure, but one way to read Schiller is that he kind of here agrees very much with Kant that freedom, that you are free when you kind of determine the moral laws by your own will. But of course the point then is that this is not just your will and your will, but actually it needs to be also universally valid. So anyway, roughly, if I understand Schiller here correctly, the idea is to, in this respect, to kind of agree with Kantian moral autonomy and Kantian ethics, but then argue that, okay, that's still not sufficient for sustained moral behavior. So we need also more like a moral behavior that is inclined and internalized, and there our sensibility plays an important role, and also art can kind of promote this kind of ethical Bildung, ethical self-perfection. Okay, and then the kind of metaphysical question, what grounds this? If we're talking about Schiller, I think he wasn't a metaphysician at all, or very kind of lightly. Yeah. So I'm not sure about his answer. But historically, I think what's behind this is actually kind of a Leibnizian power metaphysics. So the idea very roughly is something like that we human beings are kind of fundamentally powers. And actually then Bildung can be seen as, or this self-perfection is when we individually and collectively can kind of use our power in a kind of a complete manner. So I think that this might be a kind of metaphysical picture behind this kind of power metaphysics. But of course, then there is also the social aspect. So somehow also the community is a kind of ground. But as far as I know, Schiller, of course there were differences between classical Bildung philosophers also in this respect, but as far as I know, Schiller didn't kind of rely on any kind of a religious metaphysical grounding like a theist grounding. So one way to understand that is that, okay, we just have to live with the fact that there is no that kind of supernatural, infinite, transcendent metaphysical ground. The ground is us and our society. And that is supposed to be still sufficient for ethics and also for answering existential questions about the meaning of life.
I'm curious how this would relate to the notion of self-sacrifice. You know, and maybe it would be in terms of understanding the broader community, because I think most people would, you know, recognize that to sacrifice yourself for the sake of a greater good, even your own life, is a good thing, right? So I guess how does that fit into a framework that would view ethics as only relevant to, you know, this immanent sphere?
Yeah, that's a good question. As such, perhaps Bildung philosophy, classical Bildung philosophy is compatible with certain kind of self-sacrifice, because you have to remember that in this kind of thinking, the highest good is immanent to this world. So it's self-perfection. But because this is not only kind of individual thing, but also self-perfection of humanity, of the humankind, of course that seems to be compatible with at least certain kind of self-sacrifices to that highest good for perfecting humanity as such. But it seems to me that it's at the best very restricted, because the emphasis is so much on individual flourishing and perfecting yourself, and that might, of course, at least in practice, be in conflict in some kind of more communal objects as well.
So this notion of perfection, you're thinking more in, yeah, because when I think of the idea of perfection, right, if the goal is perfection, the question is, but if you have this desire and that's your goal, has anybody ever reached it? Or is it more perceived in a, I don't know, maybe more of a Hegelian sense? Is it more of like there is this kind of telos towards which all of humanity derives? I mean, I don't think he talks about world spirit, I'm assuming, but...
Yeah, I understand it. It's perhaps it's better to think it as some kind of ideal, which is perhaps not kind of fully realized ever in one's life or in the history of humankind, but still it's a valuable thing to try to achieve it. And of course, this is very familiar for a philosopher, because I think that okay, philosophy won't ever get to full wisdom, even though we love wisdom, as the very term philosophy says. So I think we still can have this very kind of valuable things in the processes where the telos or the goal is something we cannot kind of fully realize or achieve ever, but still we can become more perfect in the process, and that's a good thing. That's a valuable thing.
Do we have questions from the audience at this point? If we have, you can raise your hand. Yes, please.
First question would be to Jani.
Oh, sorry. We have a mic. Sorry, I forgot to tell you. So let's wait for the mic. So this ones listening on the stream can hear as well.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. Thank you very much for your thoughts. I think it's an interesting conversation. And my first question would be going to Jani. I'm intrigued. So for Schiller, you said that there might be this history of a Leibnizian metaphysics, yeah, and that's something where there's a power to people or individuals, and they kind of do something with it. Where does it come from, and what makes it, and what is it even for Leibniz?
Okay, thanks, Miro. So, of course, this is historically a bit speculative, but and also indirect in Schiller's case. But really, the Leibniz's monadology, which is a kind of power metaphysics, seems to be lurking behind this. But it's, of course, kind of indirect influence. So, of course, according to Leibniz, each of us, are monads, which perhaps should be understood as powers of perception and apperception. So, and that also gives our essence. So this might be the kind of, at least historically, certain metaphysical view that it's in the background here. In Bildung philosophy, that's one thing. Is this enough, or should I say more about Leibniz?
I think it's a very complex thing. I think that's something, and I don't want to bog down the conversation too much here because it might come up some other way. But thanks. Yeah.
But the basic idea is that we need to realize our own power of powers. That's what perfection consists in. This is roughly the idea.
Could one way then, okay, so my question was kind of where the power comes from. So then we are the creators of the power, in that sense.
Of course, in Leibniz they come from his view of the Christian God, but I'm not sure whether Schiller would endorse that. So I'm just saying that this is what I see kind of historically, what is perhaps influencing metaphysically Schiller's and other classic Bildung philosophers, but it's indirectly. But it doesn't mean that each of them are kind of endorsing Leibniz's metaphysics, including his view on God and creation, which is of course one philosophical, theological view about those matters.
When I think about this idea of perfection, I guess the challenge I see in like non-theistic conceptions that deal with humanity that are talking about perfection is that it seems to me that it demonstrates that we do have, and this is part of Descartes' argument for the existence of God, is that like we have this notion of perfection, he says of a perfect being, and like we're finite. Why do we have and we're imperfect, and we recognize ourselves as imperfect, and I think. And that's why most of these thinkers aren't going to say, even if they're talking about human perfection, they're not going to stand here and say, I've achieved it or something, right? So there's this notion that there is imperfection, but all of us imperfect people have this kind of innate knowledge of what should be, right? This innate knowledge of perfection. So the question is, where does a notion of perfection, where does that come from if we are not perfect? How can perfection, even the notion of perfection, come from something that is not perfection? And so to me, it seems to point to something that's real. Like there's this recognition that there is this perfect thing and I don't have it, or I am not it. But I should be.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no,
yes.
I would be
Yeah,
tempted to think that somehow it's just our construct, the concept. It's at least I don't believe that from having that concept we can then conclude that there must be perfect being. I would think that that's jumping into conclusion, because clearly it seems to be at least a plausible possibility that somehow it's a construct of our own thinking, perhaps collectively, but anyway.
Would you then say that it is possible for us to choose? Like if we want to see it this way, that he represents, or we want to see it your way, like they are kind of equal?
Yeah, it's. I would say then it's philosophical discussion and arguments pro and con, and yeah, that's how it is. And of course, then on the basis of that kind of a discussion, one can make a personal kind of choice what to believe and what not to believe. I'm just saying that it seems to me that it would be jumping into conclusion if you conclude from our having a notion of perfection to the existence of some kind of perfect being.
Do we have more questions in the audience? Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Cooper, Professor Cooper. You said that there is something that is transcendent, and after that transcendent thing is infinity. Okay, and then you said that this infinite thing has a soul. So what is your grounding for that? Because it seems to me that you are making some kind of jump for infinity to soul. So what happens here?
Well, I didn't say that the infinite has a soul, but I would say that the soul is that which grasps the infinite. So I'm saying that there is something internal to us that is not pure physicality, that is that which grasps even this concept of infinity.
Okay. And then you said that because of this there is God, and again, what happens here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we could talk about what the definition of God is, and there are manifold definitions. And in classical theology, we would say that every definition is deficient because God, by definition, can't be defined. And just use a definition there, even if it was a negative one. So I would say that we can define God in a number of ways. One is we could define God as the infinite. We could define God as being, the source of being. We could define God in a number of ways, and there are arguments, as I mentioned, Descartes' argument, and I know Descartes' argument isn't always compelling in terms of this notion of perfection, because he argues from the definition of God that the notion of perfection would have to derive from a perfect being. Even if you don't find Descartes' maybe argument logically conclusive, what I think and what I'm trying to point out is that we as human beings have these innate longings that seek to be filled. And if we see that in these other innate desires that we have internally for things, like I said, the physical things, and those actually point to something that actually satiates them, then is it not also rational to conclude that it would be a sensible position to say that we have these innate desires for perfection that you even see even in this philosophy? There's this notion of human perfection, of harmony, of things that aren't really found in this world and aren't really found in human life. And I would say that this points to what is really an innate knowledge right? An innate knowledge in the soul of there is a thing that it is hungering for. And so what is that? And if what we are hungering for is perfection internally, not something that is merely physical or temporal, then the perfect being would be God, would be a definition of God.
Yeah, but you can explain the same thing without God. You can use Platon's ideas, for example. The thing you have just used as an example, that is what Plato used. That we have some idea of beauty and all that things. We don't
and Plato was right. I agree with Plato.
Yeah, and then you make...
But Plato believed that there was an ultimate good. I mean, he called this the good. You know, did he have a detailed conception of like a Trinitarian God, or something like that? No, but Plato did recognize that there must be an immaterial source. That is the source of being itself. And so Plato didn't just have these ethereal ideas that were like detached from some singular being, which is precisely why Plato has this notion of unity or the one as one of his transcendentals as well. So I think the one or the good that we find in Plato, and then more so even in the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, this is God.
Yeah, but my point is that you don't need a God to explain Plato's ideas or Plato's idea of beauty. That is something that you have added to that.
I don't think so.
Well, then we agree to disagree.
No, yeah. I mean, obviously we can't get into like we probably don't have time to get into all the classical arguments for the existence of God here, and I know I could keep going, but I know that's probably maybe take us too far
Yeah,
afield.
thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, and thank you for the wonderful discussion here. I would like to ask a question from both of you actually, from a merely practical standpoint when it comes to the topic of the discussion about the meaning of life. So we have heard about these different philosophical aspects of around the issue. But if somebody who's trying to grasp these concepts that you're talking about is actually in the feeling what you described at the start, the existential crisis or the meaning crisis, and could be like trying to grasp the ideas and struggling with I feel meaningless and I don't know what to do. So from your standpoint, which I understood that is like a theistic and a non-theistic standpoint, what would you say to a person who's feeling the crisis that, okay, where do I start to grasp these concepts and to have a practical impact on my life, or not to feel meaningless in life? What would you say to this kind of person?
Want to start?
Okay. These kind of questions are always very difficult to philosophers, especially academic philosophers like me, because of course I would be if I confronted a person who is reporting those kind of feelings, I would be very cautious of what to say and what to do, because of course I'm not a psychologist or any kind of doctor, because clearly then that person is suffering from something. So, but perhaps if kind of ideally I would say something along the lines that you should, or perhaps you shouldn't, but it might be a good idea to perhaps start reading some philosophy on this issue, because, for example, contemporary philosophical discussion on the topic of meaning life, because that might help you to understand your own situation. So you get concepts, you get arguments, and that might promote your understanding of your feelings and situation, and that might help. Of course, in philosophy is no guarantee to anything. It's the nature of philosophy. So also for that reason, I would be a bit hesitant and cautious of what to say. But perhaps ideally, at least, I would say something along those lines. For example, of course, in my work as a philosophy teacher here at the University of Tampere University, I sometimes confront these kind of situations with students, but those in those kind of occasions, I will try to tell them that okay, you should contact these people who are more kind of experts on how to help you.
Yeah, I guess, if I'm going to answer that question, it's hard to give one answer because I feel like I have my academic hat and my pastor hat because I do both of those. And I think that the answers will be a little bit different, right, that I would give in both of those roles. So, to put the, more academic hat on first, I would say I think when you look at the classical mode of doing philosophy, so look at Plato or Socrates or Aristotle, or later thinkers, St. Thomas Aquinas or something like that. These thinkers didn't view philosophy merely as a speculative exercise that was just ongoing intellectual discussion. I think they really viewed philosophy as practical. Right? It had an end, and the end of philosophy was really in the virtuous life, the good life. And the goal of knowledge or of wisdom is to encounter and understand and know that which is eternal. Right? So you've got Plato's classic allegory of the cave, where you've got this reality that's outside of the cave, how things really are, but you've got all these people that are just looking at the shadows that the real things are making in the cave. And I think Plato's analogy is apt today too. Is that we try, I think, to find our purpose and delight and happiness and fulfillment within those shadows. And I think that's ultimately why we still feel the longing. I think that's why we still feel the search, and we continue to search. But is this, is philosophy a search without an end? And that's where I would say, no, I think it has an end. I think that we like the search for wisdom, and we engage in the search for wisdom because there is an answer. And so I would say that the person searching for meaning needs to, get out of the cave and turn around and look at reality as it is. And reality as it is has something that transcends your temporal existence, that imparts and gives being and meaning to your temporal existence. Of course, as a pastor, I would give a more specific answer, because as a pastor, I would point people to the good news of Jesus. I mean, that's what I would do. I'd point them to the forgiveness of sins and eternal life through Him. So I think that there is, there is an answer. I think there's more than just searching for an answer. I think there actually is an answer that is to be found.
Okay, another question?
We have one question on the live chat. So it goes like this. If we have freedom, why am I still going to hell just because I did not choose what God wants to be good? Does God define freedom? I read it again. If we have freedom, why am I still going to hell just because I did not choose what God wants to be good? Does God define freedom?
I feel like the question of hell is like way beyond the topic here. This brings us down a whole other kind of thing. So I don't even know if I could answer that sufficiently enough to actually address that. I mean, that's a theological issue. So I don't know what you want me to do here exactly. But maybe I could just address the question of God and freedom. Not that I want to leave aside that question. I just want to give sufficient answer to it to be able to.
Yeah, someone is making a lot of assumptions that
I know,
we haven't
this
spoken
isn't even-
about so far. Yeah.
So, but if I could just address, God and freedom and the question of what is freedom. So I think the way that some people perceive of freedom is like the ability of one to pick one of two options. Right? So that freedom is the freedom to be able to do X or Y. I think in any theistic conception of freedom that perceives of God as ultimately good in his essence, you can't really have that perspective of freedom. Because God, if he is defined by perfection, that means that God is unable by his nature to do that which is imperfect. Now that limits his choices. And so in some sense, you could say that if you're just talking about the multiplicity of choices, well, God is always bound to do the right thing because the right thing is his nature. But human beings can do the right thing or do the wrong thing or do a mix of both. So I think that perception of freedom, I think, is a mistaken notion. Now, there are theologians that would take it's called a voluntarist perspective of freedom, which would say that God essentially determines what moral law is. And God, William of Ockham famously says that God could have determined that lying was a morally right thing to do if he decided to do so. But God just didn't choose to do so. The other perspective would say that, no, lying is wrong because God is not a liar. Like God is the source of goodness. He is the good, and that therefore what is morally good, or what is good in any sense, is that which aligns with God's character. And I would take that latter approach. So with that being the case, I think we have to be careful to define freedom not just as having a bunch of choices. But I would say that, aligned with the classical philosophical traditions, we would speak more about, you said the kind of positive definition of freedom, right? Rather than just freedom from constraint, that negative definition, which, some following more the Hobbesian tradition tend to go in that direction. I would say that freedom is really freedom to do the good. And so the way that the classical philosophers perceived freedom was, true freedom was freedom over the appetites, right? So they would say having the ability to just do whatever you want is not a true freedom. If you just tell a child that they can just do whatever they want and eat whatever they want in the house, that child may choose to just go and eat a bunch of chocolate all the time. Well, if that child has a diet of only chocolate and is never taught anything else, now it's probably very difficult for them to start a healthy diet because it doesn't taste good, because their body's gotten used to all the sugar that they're having all the time. So what is freedom in some sense, that they don't have any restraints, they can do whatever they want, actually leads them to slavery. Now they're a slave to their passions. Right? Now they're a slave to their gluttony because you've trained yourself to do so. So freedom in this classical sense is freedom over the passions, right? The inner desires. To be able to rationally examine your life and step outside of your acts and say, what is the right decision? And freedom is the ability to say, I will not act in accord with what is that wrong desire because it would have bad outcomes or because it would be, morally impermissible or whatever. So freedom is always, I think, to be defined as, true freedom is freedom for the good.
I think the question...
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure, you want to.
If I may, perhaps I would say here that true freedom is freedom to perfect yourself, what you are.
To realize yourself, kind of,
yes.
to be the best version of yourself.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
And then the
Roughly.
question is, what is that, though? How do you define
of course
it? How do you grasp that?
The point is that there is also individual variety in that, so it's not given. So you have to realize it yourself, and this way we can also realize the full humanity collectively in the long run, so to speak.
I still think the question, they mentioned hell in the question. I think it's a really interesting question. It could be a whole discussion of itself, so I don't know how much time we have to go into it. But there is also like, I guess they were talking about hell after this life, but there's also for some people hell in this life. Like, that's not fair either. Like, so any comments on this hell question, even if it's
the problem of evil.
Yeah, it is, and that's like as you know, there's a very long tradition of discussion about this, and this is a separate talk that I would have.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't really want to touch it, but I will say that in our understanding of, I'm not trying to touch it because it's like controversial or something, and I don't want to offend somebody. I just think it merits more discussion in this kind of forum. But yes, I mean, I do believe that as we speak about God as goodness. Goodness also is to be understood in opposition to evil, or really rather, evil is the opposition to good. Good is the thing that actually has being. Evil is non-being. It's like darkness is just the absence of light. So we understand good and evil in relation to one another. And if God is truly good, then he is going to deal with evil in an ultimate sense. And he will do that, just as when you turn on the light, it eradicates the darkness. God, as the light, and that is biblical language, does deal with the issue of evil. And of course, as a Christian, I would say that I think this is the cross. I'd say this is the purpose of the cross, is that this is why we center our faith in the Christian tradition on the self-giving of the eternal Logos, of the eternal Son, because in this, and I don't want to say balance between, as if they're like contradictory things that have to be aligned, but in this understanding of the relationality between God's love and goodness and justice, which are all elements of God, or rather human, inadequate terms to describe the very simple essence or nature of God, we have to recognize that all of these things come together. And it's on the cross that the eternal Logos, the Son, rather than choosing to mete out justice upon those who deserve it for their injustice, has chosen to take it upon himself in our place.
Yeah, perhaps just to point out that the problem of evil is not only a problem for theists and monotheists. So there are even secular versions of the problem, but also in ancient philosophy, Professor Cooper mentioned Plotinus, who was a kind of a late ancient Platonist philosopher, and he wasn't of course a Christian or Muslim or Jew. He, of course, in his metaphysics, he has the ground of being the one from which being and everything emanates, but one shouldn't understand Plotinus is the one as some kind of a monotheistic God, even though he, of course, sometimes calls it God, but it's still a different, or supposed to be a different thing. But because he also identifies the one with the good, then he clearly has the problem why there is this evil and suffering in the world, if everything ultimately comes from the good, the one. Mm-hmm. And one reading of Plotinus' answer is that evil is nothing. Evil doesn't actually exist. It's like holes in the Swiss cheese. So that should be understood. That's the first step to get an answer to the problem of evil according to Plotinus. But just to point out that the problem of evil, I think, is a real philosophical problem. Of course, in different variety, kind of quite independently from religious views or views about the ground of being or the ultimate source of being.
Yeah, it's one of those questions that I think is a reality that is in this world, and I don't think there is an easy answer to it, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it for anybody.
Yeah.
And And there are, I think, elements of an answer that we can find. And I think, Augustine follows Plotinus there. And I think that it's helpful as far as it goes. I don't think it's clearly explanatory, though, either. But I think there are just realities. And this is also the biblical witness. If you look at the wisdom book of Job in the Old Testament, which is a book about the problem of evil, doesn't really answer the problem of evil. And I think it says some things, but it doesn't really give a comprehensive answer. And I think that's kind of the point too. So there is a wrestling with that question that I think everyone has to somehow wrangle with it. And you could, I guess maybe you could say, well, it's easy to answer that if there is no good or evil, but that also is a problematic view to take because I don't think people really want to commit to the idea that, horrible atrocities aren't actually evil either. So that's a non-answer, but it's to say that there are questions that I think are not easily answerable.
We really don't have time for more questions because we were supposed to stop now at 7:30. But you may have possibilities to talk at least to Dr. Cooper afterwards. You were in more of a hurry. So thank you for the questions so far, and thank you for coming to this event. Thank you for this discussion. It feels like we kind of just got a little.
Scratched the surface.
Yeah, exactly. But it was interesting. So thank you so much. If you still want to say some, last words to end what you want to present, that's possible.
I don't know if I have last words other than thank you. Thank all of you for being here. This is hopefully this was a beneficial discussion. I enjoyed it. I learned some things, and I hope that you could just think about some of these things, contemplate some of this, and think through it deeply.
Yeah, it's more important try to achieve wisdom than to become wise. I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.